Adlib presents Don't Be Sorry, written and read by Sarah Roberts. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Adlib. Prologue. A message popped into my inbox late one Friday evening. It was the kind of message you get that you read and feel you can't leave to come back to after the weekend. They needed me now. It went something along the lines of this. I've had a baby 2 days ago and he has Down syndrome. I'm struggling so hard, I just don't know who to turn to. Everyone I know is sending me congratulations on my beautiful baby, and I just want to scream. I can't manage to think beyond what's happening right now without getting massive anxiety. If I think into the future at all, it makes me feel sick. I know in my mind it will be fine. I just want to know it in my heart. It's coming to terms with a new life, a new normal. It's being okay with a baby that doesn't look like us. How long before I can look at all my friends who've just had babies or who are pregnant at the same time as I was and not feel envious? How long did it take you to start adjusting? Last night was the first night I was able to settle him in the night, and I think I felt the first drops of love. It is coming. I know it is. As I sat and read every word she'd written, recalling how I'd felt just 2 days after having had Oscar, a wave of sadness came over me. I'd been there, you see. Every single word she'd written resonated with me. Yet here I was now, 9 years on, someone who'd lived through the highs and lows of parenting a child with Down syndrome, and who understood all too well the difficulties. And yet, whilst I'd also lived through the many heart-bursting, pride-inducing moments that come with having a child like ours, I'd still wondered if now was the right time to tell her the truth. How did I tell her that I too struggled at first? That for a long, long time following Oscar's diagnosis, it felt like someone had ripped out my heart, so much so that it felt like a physical pain. How did I tell her that every time I received a congratulations on your beautiful baby boy card and placed it on my windowsill, I resented the card because this wasn't the way I'd planned our lives to go, and I couldn't bear looking at them all lined up there? How did I tell her that the image I'd had of the older gentleman who happened to have Down syndrome, walking around our village on his own, with dodgy clothes and a bad haircut, talking to himself, was the only image I pictured back then, and that had scared me? Could I tell her that? How did I tell her it took that broken heart of mine some time to heal too? Did I tell her that when well-meaning people who'd had older children with DS themselves spoke about speech therapy, physiotherapy, portage, EHCPs, and goodness knows what else came with this new role, how petrified I'd been and how I'd wanted out from the start? Did I risk telling her that this new normal others talked of filled me with dread, and I couldn't for a second see how we could ever be happy again? How did I say that for a long time afterwards, when I heard friends or family members had fallen pregnant, I willed something like this to happen to them too because I didn't want to be the only one? I wanted them to feel everything I had. I didn't want to feel alone. Could I tell her that? I knew the answer. I knew it would be hard reading, but I had to tell her my truth, because in doing so, hopefully she wouldn't feel so alone, or as awful as I'd felt for feeling like I was the only person out there experiencing such dark, dark thoughts. So I would tell her how things had been for me back then, but also how they were now. I would tell her that all this was my truth, and that I wouldn't and couldn't talk on behalf of every mother out there who'd experienced this, because everyone's story is different. I would tell her that the pain had passed sooner than I had thought it would. It wasn't a thunderbolt type epiphany or anything like that. It was just that over time, I realised I wasn't quite as sad as I'd been the week before, or the week before that. I would tell her that in hindsight, I was glad that we'd received the congratulation cards, for I'd decided that it would have been a very sad time if people had felt they couldn't send them because they'd assumed there was nothing to be celebrated. I was so grateful, and I felt their love and support. I would tell her that the outdated stereotypes are long gone because in my mind, Oscar is one of the coolest kids I know. I would tell her that with early intervention and not putting limitations on what we think our kids are capable of, kids and adults with DS are achieving so much more than ever before. The new normal? I would say it's not what I imagined it would be in the slightest. If anything, it's opened my eyes to a completely different world, one that I love being a part of. I would tell her that the hurt, the upset, the resentment, and the worry have long gone now. And I would tell her that the love came thick and fast once all the other stuff had gone. The thing is, how could I make that sound credible? without it coming across as too happy-clappy. So many people say, he, she's a gift from God, and special children are given to special people when they talk about children who happen to have DS. That you're only sent what you can handle, and that you're #blessed is just not my bag. I don't know that I believe any of it personally. And as a side note, how do any of us know how it's all going to pan out? How any of our kids, regardless of diagnosis, are going to end up? None of us know, right? All too often you assume life's going one way, then it takes a weird and wonderful turn somewhere else. What I do know is that this is my experience, no one else's, and although I know others may have felt some of the same emotions, it won't have been like this for everyone. So, what do I say when someone like this woman contacts me, asking me to throw her a life raft because she feels like right now she's sinking? I say there isn't a day that goes by that I don't look at Oscar's beautiful face and feel so insanely grateful that he's mine. I say that with more certainty, more clarity than anything I've ever felt before, because that's my hand-on-heart truth. Chapter 1. Lockdown Runaway. They laugh at me because I'm different. I laugh at them because they're all the same. Unknown. It was the spring of 2020. The UK was in lockdown because of the global COVID-19 pandemic. I was at home with 3 kids, Oscar 7, Alfie 6, and Flo 4, attempting to homeschool them. Chris, my husband, was at home too, but thankfully, and resented on my bitter and twisted part, he was able to hide in his man cave, his purpose-built office shed at the end of the garden, and busy himself with work earning a living, but mostly, I assumed, avoiding the carnage unfolding around us all. I cried to my mum down the phone when I told her we'd taken the decision to take the kids out of school, although it ended up being only 3 days before the rest of the UK. Oscar was classed as vulnerable because of borderline pulmonary hypertension, and the anxiety and worry about whether we should take him out of school to avoid the risk of catching the virus was all-consuming. This meant that our other 2 children would also be taken out of school, as there'd be little point in their staying and running the risk of bringing COVID-19 home. I knew it was the right thing to do for Oscar's health. You do anything to protect your children, right? But quite selfishly, the thought of being home 24/7 with 3 children, one of whom has additional needs, filled me with horror and dread. As it turns out, we got through it. The homeschooling part was hit and miss. If I managed to get Oscar to sit down and do a 10-minute activity once a day, that was a win in my book. But the hard part was managing what he was up to whilst focusing my attention on Alfie and Flo's learning. It was hot that year, so he spent a lot of time in the garden, jumping in and out of the paddling pool. We have bifold doors in our kitchen that open out onto the garden. Although I had a good view of what Oscar was doing, there were times when I'd missed some bit of mischief because my attention was on the other 2 children. Like the time he managed to drive his little Tykes car next to one of our neighbours' fence panels, hoist himself up over it, jump down into their garden and run barefooted into their house. Chris, by this point, was in hot pursuit. He had had to abruptly leave a Zoom meeting telling his team he'd be back, but he just had to go over the garden fence to get his son. Oscar had found his way upstairs into the neighbour's spare bedroom and was now waving down at me with the biggest grin on his face. I could feel my cheeks burn with rage. "Get down," I mouthed to him, panicking that lovely Brenda, our elderly neighbour, would be having kittens. At this stage in the UK, none of us were allowed into each other's houses for fear of spreading COVID-19, so you can imagine the look of horror on my and eventually Brenda's face when we realised what he'd done. Thankfully, she was suitably lovely about it all. Another time, there'd been a knock at the door, which turned out to be another neighbour who lived opposite, and a sheepish-looking Oscar standing behind her. Apparently, while I'd been reading with Alfie, he managed to locate the key to our front door, open it, head over the road, and bold as brass knock on their door. By all accounts, our neighbour had seen him walking down her driveway and had been concerned that something had happened to either Chris or me, and that Oscar was coming to alert her. As heroic as that sounded, I told her it was more likely that he was after her sons, whom he'd often seen playing football in the street and wanted to join them. Then there was the day I realised, having taken my eyes off Oscar for a few moments, that he was now nowhere to be seen. I'd raced out into the garden, my heart in my mouth, knowing he had previous for taking any opportunity to break out. I'd started shouting his name, hoping he'd pop out from somewhere and I could go back to Alfie and his place value. Yeah, I have no clue either. Except there was no response. Our garden backs onto 5 other houses, so at this stage of the game he could have been, frankly, anywhere. After shouting his name a few more times, I heard a giggle, and what sounded like a spring going up and down. "Oscar, where are you?" I would recognise that cheeky giggle anywhere. He laughed again, clearly finding it hysterical now. As I walked towards where the noise was coming from and peered over the garden fence, I could see Oscar jumping up and down on our neighbour's trampoline, laughing away to himself. The next issue was how to get him back. Our neighbours have no side access, and the only way to get into their garden is through their house. Knowing that they were being super cautious because a member of their family was vulnerable, I knew they wouldn't be happy about me walking through their house or with their little visitor. We eventually got him out by holding the fence panel up so Chris could crawl underneath and through their bushes to retrieve him. I think Chris had been mid-call again, so obviously this escapade went down like a lead balloon with him. But seriously, this kid! And it's not just great escapes that make us known to our neighbours. There was the time as I was walking back from the village shop that I was pulled to one side by another neighbour, who let me know that a pair of pants had ended up in his garden, which then promoted great discussion between him and his wife about whose pants they were, because they were too big to be Oscar's but seemed far too big to be Sarah's. As it turns out, they were mine. I knew they were mine as soon as they started talking, but I was too embarrassed to claim them, knowing that they'd been my ginormous ones that I'd had out on the drying rack a couple of days beforehand. Can you imagine the mortification? As I write this, Oscar has just turned 9. I remember when I first had Oscar being told that he would be a joy and would light up my world. And whilst I'm not denying that he is, and that he has done, he has also aged me by 50+ years. He's the reason I'm going grey and often lies at the root of my ever-increasing stress levels. Just to take those of you who haven't read my first book, For the Love of Oscar, back to the start. Oscar was born on 7th of July 2012, after a traumatic birth, but what can only be described as a straightforward pregnancy. Chris and I had been fortunate enough to fall pregnant the month after our honeymoon. When I look back on it with the benefit of hindsight, before the brief discussion with the midwife at my 12-week scan, when she told me they were screening for Down syndrome, Edwards syndrome and Patell's syndrome, DS hadn't even factored in my thoughts. When I'd had the screening, Oscar had been classed as low risk of having DS. I could go on and on about this, but I'll just touch on it for now. The word risk when referring to DS is awful. Thankfully, due to many of our community harping on about it so much and campaigning for change, a lot of the literature used by student midwives has now been amended to use the word chance or likelihood. E.g., the chance of your baby having DS is 1 in 10,000, as opposed to the risk of your baby having DS. See? Anyway, the word risk is still bandied about by midwives, consultants and sonographers. Women write to me regularly to let me know, and I just think it fuels such fear and panic. I mean, imagine if you were pregnant and someone told you there was a risk of something happening. Scary, right? Anyway, when we got the screening results back and I had been classed as low chance, I don't think it ever occurred to me that something like this would happen to me. DS just wasn't something I ever thought about. It's a bit like when you look at other people having horrific car crashes or getting poorly. You look on and think, gosh, that's horrendous. But mostly you're thinking, I couldn't ever imagine that happening to me. Except here's the thing. Shit things happen to people every day. Illness, breakups, losing loved ones, the list goes on. And in my 43 years' life on this earth, I've come to realise that none of us is exempt from life not going the way we had planned it, despite my naively thinking that I was untouchable. And that's the way I saw Oscar and the bombshell of his diagnosis for some time. I'd find myself on a different path to the one I had imagined for myself. I thought my life had taken a dreadful turn for the worse. When I heard the words, "I'm so sorry, we suspect your baby has Down syndrome," I imagined a life sentence. I thought we'd always be sad and that the way others viewed us would be with pity. I spent a lot of time wondering, why us? Why Oscar? Why not someone else? Until it dawned on me that there was no rhyme or reason for anything that gets decided for us. So actually, why not? I think a lot of those negative thoughts in the beginning weren't helped by the way Oscar's paediatrician that night had delivered the news. There's no denying I had a fixed view of the way I saw DS myself, which is probably part and parcel of the way that so many of us see DS and what it would mean for us. I saw sadness, no respite, and a lot of dribble. And whilst I wasn't expecting a Rockette-style kickline to announce her suspicions, I often wonder why she didn't at least start with congratulations. I just had a baby after all. Wasn't that worth something? In fact, there were no congrats, no mention of the fact that he was beautiful, just an apology, which indicated to me that she thought this news for her would have been the worst imaginable. And as an impressionable, petrified, first-time mother lying in a hospital bed wondering WTF had just happened, that doctor's opinion really mattered to me. I therefore often ponder, would it have been better after she congratulated us and commented on our gorgeous bundle for her to say something along the lines of, Now, the news I'm about to tell you will be unexpected, but please don't panic at this stage. We suspect that Oscar may have Down syndrome. There really hadn't been any need for an apology. I guess everyone's different, and whilst DS might be the worst news for some, others may see it as a gift or blessing. How did she know I didn't feel that way? Who was she to put her unconscious bias on me? Unconscious bias, counsellor chat. Anyway, I digress. The beginning for me was hard. I say me because from the very start, Chris has been very pragmatic about it all. Oscar's diagnosis isn't something we can change, so the way he's viewed it is to just get on with it. I've often wondered over the past 9 years if he might crack, if at any point he might feel hard done by. Because I'm going to be honest, when I've been chasing Oscar through our village because I've stupidly given him the benefit of the doubt, left too much space between us and ended up giving it my best Usain Bolt after him, I'm not going to lie, I felt hard done by. But Chris? Never. Not for a minute has he ever resented that our lives with Oscar, on occasion, have been just that little bit harder than if Oscar didn't have that extra chromosome. Not once. And honestly, I love him a bucket load more for that. So those early few weeks and months were tough. I had this idealistic view of what my new little family was supposed to look like, only now I had a disabled son, and now we were carers. I described it as a grief of sorts, which I'm conscious might be an insult to those who have lost a child, but it honestly did feel like someone had ripped my heart out in those first few weeks. I was grieving for the baby I thought I'd have, and it hurt. For a long time, I resented others who had had their typical babies. Every time someone fell pregnant and subsequently had a baby, I found myself wishing their baby would have DS too, so someone else would understand how I felt. With that, though, came guilt. I sobbed, again to my mum, because I'd find myself thinking these awful things and felt bad that my thoughts could contain such poison. I remember joining new baby and toddler groups, feeling like it was the right thing to do for me as a new mum and for Oscar's development, only to be faced with huge anxiety about having to introduce myself and explain Oscar's diagnosis. When he was little, I was so conscious of the stares and the apologetic looks. Then there were the people who would avoid all eye contact for fear of what to say or how to react. It must be so incredibly hard, some would say, tilting their heads to one side. All the while, I'd be looking at their seemingly perfect baby and their perfect lives, and I'd feel jealous. Things got easier, of course. I realised after a short while that despite it not being the route we'd planned, a mother's love had taken over. In the beginning, Oscar had lots of appointments, mainly medical, to check his heart, his thyroid, his lungs, his hearing, his sight. He had appointments with his consultant paediatrician, his physiotherapist, his occupational therapist, and speech therapist. It felt never ending. But it was around 9 months into his little life that we were told that the holes in his heart had grown bigger and that he'd need heart surgery. Within a few weeks, we found ourselves at the Royal Brompton Hospital, London, signing the papers for our baby son to have life-saving surgery. That, for me, was the turning point. The moment that I realised that DS now paled into insignificance. DS was nothing when the thought of losing him was too much even to begin to imagine. I always talk about Oscar's surgery being huge for me. It was the point when I knew that I loved this baby with my whole heart. Before I go on, just to fill in a few more gaps, 16.5 months after Oscar, we had another baby, a boy who we named Alfie. And then 20 months after that, we had a baby girl who we call Florence. In hindsight, I'm almost certain I had Alfie so soon to make up for failings I'd felt the first time round. I'd wanted to give Chris the perfect child. I'd wanted our families to feel the euphoria they should have done when I gave birth to Oscar, instead of feeling helpless and like there was nothing they could do to fix things. I think I thought I wouldn't feel so sad about Oscar's diagnosis if I had a typical baby. Except when I had Alfie, all I felt was guilty that I'd had him so fast, and now my attention was to be shared between my 2 sons. By the time I had Flo, though, I'd given myself a break. Flo was a much-wanted baby girl who completed our family, and once I'd given birth to her, I felt truly genuine happiness, despite us now having 3 children, all in nappies. And you know what? Since having 3 very different children, I've learned that all children come with their challenges. Diagnosis or not, being a parent to any child is hard. Sure, with the other 2 there mightn't be flagged needs, but there are still worries. In a lot of ways, Oscar is much simpler, easier child than the other 2. At 9 years old, as cliché as it sounds, and I hate a cliché when it comes to DS, as sometimes people assume once they've met one person with DS, they've met them all. He's so happy and content for the most part. Once you've gained his trust, he will love you so completely. With Alfie and Flo, there are mood swings, there are manipulative behaviours. They don't always tell the truth. With Oscar, you get what you see. A boy who lives his best life, a boy who finds joy in the unexpected. In fact, I'm sure we could all do with being a bit more like Oscar. When he feels the music, he dances and sings. When he's in the back of the car, he asks for the window down and he'll sit with his head out the car and enjoy the feeling of the breeze on his face, where others might close it because it's got too chilly. He has no inhibitions. He'll be the first to walk into a room at a party or approach another child at the park. There is never any agenda with him. He expects others to take him as he is. We went through some tricky patches with Oz. The biting phase, which lasted a good 18 months from the age of around 2 to 3.5, was one of the worst. I became so fearful of taking him to soft play or letting him go on a bouncy castle at another kid's party, because we realised that he needed sensory feedback when he was playing physically, and a bite was his way of getting that. He also bit very intentionally if another child had a toy he wanted. I was, and I suppose only in the last couple of years have I been less of one, a helicopter parent. You know the types, who tend to hover over their kids and become overly involved in their lives. Most helicopter parents do so to pay close attention to their kids' activities and schoolwork, not only to protect them from pain and disappointment, but to help them succeed. I, however, was a helicopter parent to mitigate the risk of Oscar taking a huge chunk out of another kid's arm and me having to deal with the kid's parent becoming Mother of the Year in their quest to make me feel bad. You probably have no idea how horrified other parents look when your kid takes a chunk out of theirs. Way to make you feel bad or what? Thankfully, Oscar grew out of that, and even to this day, when he's on a trampoline or having a game of rough and tumble with Chris, he'll spend the entire time biting his own finger, as he's learnt that that's a great way for him to get that sensory feedback and not get in trouble for biting someone. He's a clever sausage. This book covers where I left off at the end of For the Love of Oscar, when Oscar, aged 4, had just started school, and brings us up to today with Oscar, aged 9. It's an opportunity to look back and recognise how far he's come, but also to acknowledge some of the challenges along the way. Still to this day, when he achieves the next milestone, it feels even more special because we know just how much work he's put in to achieve it. We still find magic in this every single time. Blog comments. Grace is the youngest of 4. She does take up our attention quite a lot, but she's 5, so some of that is just being young. But what we didn't realise was just how much we would all gain. The compassion, tolerance of people who are different, seeking justice for those who cannot for themselves. Realising how much DS is secondary to who Grace is, it's amazing to watch all my children with her. Linda Castle. Alex, DS, is 25. He has 2 sisters, one 27 who he loves with a passion, and one 21 who he blames for everything. The rain, the traffic. He misses them both now they are away, living their own lives. They are both very protective of him though. If their friends comment negatively, they cease to be considered friends. I think they would both say they are more rounded people due to having him in their lives. D. Owen Paxton. My 2 are very typical siblings. They look out for each other, get annoyed with each other, play nicely, fight, argue over TV programmes. Audrey, DS, is 8, and Rex, neurotypical, is almost 6. I've seen them both stick up for each other at tricky times, so I'm confident they'll be support to each other. At the park, some boys were being mean to Rex, and Audrey shouted, "Stop being mean to my brother!" Sometimes she has no fear. Another time, a kid was trying to pull Audrey's glasses off her face, and Rex blocked them. He was only 2 at the time. At Vicky Woo and Audrey Boo. Chapter 2. School Run. I used to think those "where does the time go" comments from parents whose kids were starting school were a little annoying, if anything. But now I find myself one of those parents literally wondering the very same thing. It doesn't seem 5 minutes ago that I was sitting in this chair looking up at Chris behind the camera, smiling on the outside, but my eyes telling a different story. When I look back now, I see a girl needing to be told everything was going to be okay. A girl who needed someone to reassure her that having this teeny tiny dot of a baby, whom she'd been told just a few hours before was almost certain to have Down syndrome, meant that it wasn't the end of the world and that the future was a bright one for all of them. My biggest boys start school tomorrow. As you can imagine, I'm feeling a mixed bag of emotions right now. At the forefront of my mind this evening is, although I know in my heart of hearts we've made the right decision, there's a little niggling doubt wondering if we've done right by him. Will the school we've chosen be too much for him? Will he fit in? Will he struggle there? Will he be understood? Will he understand? One of the things I find hardest to come to terms with at times is the fact that Oscar can't really articulate to me how he's feeling. Sure, if he's upset or unwell, I know him well enough to know the signs. But if he's unhappy in school, he won't be able to tell me just yet. He can't tell me if someone's been nasty to him or if he's had a bad day. And equally, just as sad for me, he won't be able to tell me if he's loved his new school and all about any new friends he might have made. I guess time will tell. I trust the school. They have given me nothing but hope and faith that they have his best interests at heart. And despite not being able to actually tell me, I have to remember we have done what we thought was best for Oscar at the time. By the same token, when I think about the diagnosis of Down syndrome we got after he was born and what we thought it meant for him, I never for one moment dreamt that he'd be the little boy he's become today. Tuesday, 6th of September 2016, Oscar's first day in reception class at our local village infant school. We had toyed with sending him to other schools in the area, but our heart had been set on sending him to our local school, as we felt it would be lovely for Oscar to be known in our community, and we desperately wanted Oscar to have the opportunity to be with his little brother and sister once they started school, even for a short time. We'd also thought about sending him to a specialist school, but having looked around a couple, at that stage we'd decided that they weren't for him. When we looked at other mainstream schools, despite their saying all the right things on their websites, noting how inclusive and accepting they were of all children, some couldn't have made it more obvious that they didn't want a child like Oscar there. I remember emailing the head teacher of our local school when Oscar was just a few months old, asking if they'd be happy to take him, desperate for him to be like any other child back then. The fact that I emailed her when he was so tiny screamed of that desperation. She'd said yes, and I've since learned that they had a little girl with DS there previously. There'd been meetings set up before Oscar started. Professionals like his physio, speech therapist, occupational therapist, and educational psychologist had got involved. We hadn't quite managed to get his EHCP, Educational Health and Care Plan, in place before he started, as I was still fighting for speech and language provision, but we did know that he had been awarded full-time one-to-one support, 32.5 hours a week, who would be with him the entire time he was at school, e.g. in the classroom, and to cover breaks and lunchtime. Like any first-time mum, I'd been apprehensive in the run-up to Oscar starting school. Being a July baby, he was just 4. He was pre-verbal with only a handful of Makaton signs, and even these were Oscar's own versions, and he was still in nappies, nowhere near ready to use the toilet independently. I'd been worried because even though the school had said they were happy to take him and had done everything they could to provide for his personal care needs, I appreciated how different it would be for them having a child like Oz there. When Oscar was tiny, we were advised to start using Makaton with him. Makaton is a language program using signs and symbols to aid communication. Naively, it was the first time I had ever heard of it, and to be honest, I questioned whether it was necessary. I think in the beginning I'd been in denial that Oscar would need additional help, but Makaton is put in place to support a child's speech. Words are still spoken in addition to the signing, so speeds up and develops language learning for children with speech delay. Today, over 100,000 children and adults use Makaton symbols and signs, either as their main method of communication or to support speech. In addition to children and adults with communication and learning difficulties, and the communities around them, teachers, health professionals, friends, and public service bodies, Makaton is increasingly used by the general public to aid communication. That first year, Oscar was assigned 2 teaching assistants, which I had agreed was a good idea. One would cover the morning and one the afternoon. I'd loved the morning one, who ended up being assigned to Oz off and on for the next 4 years. She had been a teacher previously, so was so proactive in her approach to learning Makaton, something the school weren't trained in but subsequently tried to introduce, and I had faith in her from the start that she had Oscar's best interest and his progression at the forefront of everything she did. After his first day, the report back was that he had done brilliantly. Although he looked a little unsure, there had been no tears when he went in. He just gave us a hug goodbye and off he went. I don't think he even looked back, completely unfazed by the whole thing. He explored the classroom for the first 10 minutes, then settled down, playing in the home corner, interacting with his new classmates. He got a little teary in the last 5 minutes of the session, but I'm guessing he was feeling tired after all the excitement of the morning. All in all, though, a big success and a huge relief on my part. I'd been relieved that he'd settled so well, but also that I hadn't completely lost it. No one tells you how big a deal seeing your firstborn head off to school is, and how emotional you'll find yourself. I suppose it's the end of an era and you're handing your pride and joy into the hands of someone else for most of the week. Add in the fact that Oscar couldn't yet tell me how he'd got on because he hadn't yet got the speech to let me know, and that was a lot to deal with emotionally. By the end of the first week, I hoped I wasn't speaking too soon, but we were all happy. From the expression on his face when he ran out to greet me after he'd finished for the day, he seemed so at home. Although to start with he was doing only a few hours a day at a time, I think the change and the new routine hit him that first Friday evening, as he was asleep on the sofa by 6 p.m. In the mornings, he managed the 10-minute walk to school with no problems. I had been dubious initially, worrying about him running off, especially because it was a busy time of day with all the extra school traffic on both the roads and pavements. But he'd walk alongside me, and it was interesting to see that when he saw other children holding their mummy's hands, he'd wanted to hold mine, something he would never normally have instigated. On that Friday morning of the first week, however, when he stepped out of the front door, he signed that he wanted to get in the car and got a little tearful when I said we had to walk. Thankfully, he got a ride on the buggy board of the buggy I was pushing Alfie and Flo in, and he'd perked up by the time we got to school. As time went on and Oscar got more confident with where he was going each morning, the walk to school became problematical. To bystanders, things may have looked calm and collected. Oscar would walk just a short distance in front of me as I'd be pushing the double buggy with Alfie and Flo in. As his mother, I totally got everything under control. Oscar's a creature of habit. He knew to stop at the roads we had to cross. I would always give him a vocal cue. "Oscar, stop," usually shrieked at the top of my voice just in case, and he would do so well with stopping before we checked for traffic. He liked to climb on some of the small walls outside a couple of the shops on the village high street, and he gestured to me to hold his hand to help him balance. He would occasionally take a little detour into our local branch of the co-op and decide it was time to grab a basket full of essentials, but was usually compliant when I told him that we didn't need any shopping that morning. On other mornings, he may have been found wandering up to the entrance of the fruit and veg shop to say hi. But then they'd often give him a free banana, so why wouldn't he do that? He's not stupid, right? The walk home was a different story and fast becoming an Olympic sprint. It started with a downhill pursuit. Did I mention the school is on a hill? Involving Oscar darting off, closely followed by me and my double buggy jogging after him. I say jogging as I didn't want to alert the oncoming fellow parents on their way to pick up their kids. That we were completely out of control and that this kid may have outsmarted me. I would try to remain calm as I negotiated my way around them all. Small children, dogs on leads, scooters, and the occasional unassuming elderly man or woman who really didn't need to be run over by me. Oscar, it seemed, had mastered the art of weaving in and out of all these people, all the while occasionally looking behind checking that I was keeping up. He was grinning from ear to ear and clearly finding it hilarious that Mummy was running, jogging obviously sped up, in hot pursuit. My ever-increasing anxiety over the school run was getting worse. It seemed the more confident he got, the more distance there would be between us and the less safe it felt. Despite imploring him repeatedly to hold the buggy, he simply wouldn't. The turning point for me was when we had a near miss. On the way to school on this morning, along a narrow pavement, Oscar had got ahead of me and the buggy and ducked in front of another parent with her 2 children. To this day, he still has this thing that he hates walking behind people. If there's someone walking ahead of us, he has to get in front of them, which is fine when it's just one other person. But on a crowded school run? Nightmare. The double buggy was heavy and hard to handle with Alfie and Flo in it. I'd realised there was no way I'd be able to get to him as I'd have to navigate the buggy off the pavement and into the oncoming traffic. So I held my breath just hoping he'd stop. But before I knew it, he darted across the road at the traffic lights, and they weren't on red. Mercifully, although it was busy, there were no cars on the road at the time, but my heart was pounding in my chest. He had never done that before, and I'm not sure what it was that made him decide to cross the road. We didn't need to. But that was the final straw, and the moment when I decided, in the interest of his personal safety, that I'd have to put him on a rein, for a while at least, until he understood the dangers. We had done this when he was younger, but the trouble was that he was so physically able and had gained so much in confidence over the last few months that I was reluctant to take this step. Unfortunately, though, I couldn't be sure that he understood the consequences of his actions and the terrible accident that could so easily have happened that morning. I also realised that my desire to allow him to be as normal as possible and walk like the other children had endangered his life. That was unforgivable on my part. So after giving my ego a stern talking to, the next day I found his old backpack with a strap attached, packed a packet of mini cheddars for the walk home, and he was as good as gold. Lesson well and truly learnt. The following morning he went and got his school uniform and shoes to change into without me mentioning school, and over the weekend when we drove past the school he pointed and shouted, "Mum, Mum, Mum, yeah!" For the record, the only other places he lets out a cheer when we drive past or arrive at are the park, Nanny and Grumps' house and an ice cream van, so I think I can say with confidence that school had got a big thumbs up. That first term was like a roller coaster. So many highs and lows along the way. The school had started a communication diary in which the teaching assistants, teachers and I could write down and share information on how a day had gone or what sort of weekend or night Oscar had had. This was something I knew would be extremely helpful to all of us. I realised, though, that I'd been holding my breath every day when he came out, anxious to hear how he'd got on, wanting so badly for him to fit in alongside the other children. Walking into school one morning, I heard a little voice behind us call out, "Oscar! Hi, Oscar! Mummy, look, it's Oscar!" We turned round to say hello, and a little girl who happened to be in Oscar's class came running up behind him to give him a big hug. Clearly chuffed with his new admirer, Oscar continued to hug the little girl as they walked along. No mean feat, I might add. As they made their way to the school gate. "Oscar's flavour of the month at the moment," the little girl's mummy told me. "Oh, really?" I said. "That's so lovely." "Yeah, she tells me Oscar always gives lovely hugs, and he's the best dancer." Little interactions like this one meant so much, and 5 years on, they still do. One of my biggest fears when Oscar started mainstream school was that he wouldn't have any friends, so little moments like this one were precious.